everyone, and welcome to the Earthdawn Survival Guide. This podcast is a special one. We ran into some technical problems during our last recording thing, and so we're a week off, but that gave me the opportunity to snag Nick, one of the primary writers on the upcoming Vasgothia book, which is on Kickstarter now. How are you doing, Nick?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Sure. I know that people like hearing behind-the-scenes stories and insights and all that sort of stuff. We've got a kind of small listenership, but they are hungry for content, and this gives us the opportunity to get into that, or some of that anyway. We'll get to some questions. I did post in the Earthdawn Guild Facebook group that we were going to be doing this, and there were some questions that were posted, and we will be addressing some of them. But before we get into that, why don't you tell us how you came to get into Earthdawn and join the group working on this book?
Wow, so I've been playing Earthdawn for quite a long time, probably for 20 plus years. And I was introduced to it by a friend of mine who was running a vampire live action game back in the day, like a Midnight Theatre game. And he folded that game and he said, I've got this great game called Earthdawn, and do you guys want to try that? And we did, and that's how I sort of was introduced to it. Speaking of how I got involved with Vasgothia, that's probably quite a long story that goes back all the way to sort of like the days of Red Brick, if you want me to sort of get that far into it.
Sure.
Okay. So I discovered Vasgothia during our first Earthdawn session, and at the time, our GM wouldn't let us read the Theron Empire book. It was considered sort of GM-only material, so that made me determined to get hold of a copy and read it, obviously. When I did, the first page that the book fell on, when I opened it, was the image of the towers done by Jeff Laubenstein, and I just became fascinated with it. That picture and the picture of the renamed Theron Noble and the picture of the Leafer, and I was just immediately sort of attracted towards this very strange, magical place. The more I read about it, the more I wanted to run a game set there. So I started putting that together. And it was actually during the announcement of Cathay for, I think, was that Classic or was that Red Brick?
Well, Red Brick did both Classic and 3rd edition. So
right.
It would have been that crew of folks. I think Cathay probably was officially part of 3rd edition.
Right, okay. Yeah, so I think it was around the time that Cathay was announced. I was quite sort of taken aback by the announcement that they were looking at exploring this distant land. And it made me think, well, if people are interested in Cathay, then maybe they'll be interested in Vasgothia in the way that, I'm very interested in it. So I put together looking back at it now, it's a very sort of bare bones, amateurish proposal that I sent to Red Brick for a Vasgothia book. And I had a sort of very brief correspondence with Dammy, Karsten. Is it Karsten Dammy? Is that right?
Karsten Dam, yep.
And we had a little bit back and forth, and he felt that it wasn't sort of like up to scratch as a proposal, but he was quite interested in some of the ideas, and he said that at the time Red Brick were looking at making a Vasgothia book. He said that there were members of the team who were German who were quite interested in looking at Vasgothia, and when the time came, he said, I invite you to join the writing team. But unfortunately, it never materialised. That was sort of folded for about a decade, really. Then it was with the announcement of the Arancia book back on the FASA forums. I think Julie was talking about the Arancia book, and again, immediately thought to myself, well, if people are interested in exploring Arancia, then maybe they're interested in exploring Vasgothia. So that's what prompted me to put another proposal together, and this one was hopefully a little bit better than the one that I sent to Red Brick. And that's how I got in touch with FASA, and I think I spoke to yourself, I spoke to Andy. Eventually I was put in contact with Kyle. I think Andy had told me that there were plans for a Vasgothia book, and she said that I could join the writing team. And at first I thought, oh, well, I've heard this before, and nothing happened, but it didn't turn out that way. And me and Kyle got talking, and that's how I became involved, really.
And you actually worked on one of the chapters for Empty Thrones with Kyle. That was sort of your introduction to actually working with us, right?
That actually came about. That was during the writing on Vasgothia, I think. Yeah, it was because I was going through the initial manuscript phase for Vasgothia, and Kyle emailed me and said, "Oh, I've got this super secret project, and I'd be interested to know if you'd be interested in joining me on that." So I was like, "Yeah, of course. If there's an Earthdawn super secret project, then count me in." So that was, I think we took a month off writing for Vasgothia to do Empty Thrones. Yeah, it was. I think it was in the sort of January or February. We took a month off, and he originally said to me, "Would you like to write a section on Daichi, or would you like to write a new settlement on the borders of Landis?" And I said, "Can I do both?" And he said, "Sure." And that's how he said, if you can get me Daichi in, I think it was something like 2 weeks, then you can also do the town on the borderlands of Landis and Carafad. So I did both, luckily. So yeah, it was good. It was fun.
Yeah, there was quite a rapid turnaround on some of the material for that book. The planning had been in place for a little bit, but the actual production of the written stuff for Empty Thrones, in some cases, really got cranked out pretty quickly, and I was happy with actually the way that all turned out. And of course, your work on that was great, which was why our feelings on Vasgothia as a book are pretty good. Now, I will admit up front to the listeners, I've already mentioned this to you, I was not actually involved that much in the production of this book for multiple reasons. So I haven't actually had much of a chance to really read any of it. I've seen bits and pieces going by, but I've had other stuff that I've been working on and life and so on. I will actually probably be doing most of my reading when I start working on the layout, which I will be starting here as soon as Kyle gets me the final finals from proofreading. So that's probably where I'm going to run into most of this material. I think that leads us into one of our first questions here, which kind of came from a couple of people, which is, why Vasgothia and why now? Clearly, this was a book, from what you've said, that covers an area that has captured your attention for 20 years or more, from those initial impressions from the art by Jeff and Larry McDougall, I think, did the renamed Theron Noble that you referenced.
Yeah, that's right.
So clearly, for you, it's something that you have always wanted to do. You talked about the initial proposal that you made to Red Brick a decade or more ago that ended up not going anywhere. And it clearly captured your imagination so strongly that it was something that you continued to want to do. Let me rephrase that question a little bit for you, which is to say, what is it about Vasgothia that so captured your attention that made you want to do a book to develop the area in more depth?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think by the time I sort of learned more about Vasgothia, we've been playing Earthdawn for, quite a few years. And, I understood how Barsaive worked a little bit, the various political entities and how the mechanics and the setting sort of tie in together. I think when I read Vasgothia, it just seemed like such a different place to Barsaive. But at the same time, it had a lot of the strong Earthdawn themes in there as well. So there's a lot of influence from the Scourge, passions and horrors and, names, for example. But it was also differently framed. So I think one of the biggest differences that attracted me to Vasgothia was, whereas in Barsaive you have the Scourge and it's been this cataclysmic event and it's destroyed large portions of the province. You have the Badlands, you have the Wastes, the Poison Forest, and the transformations in the Bloodwood as a result of the horrors. In Vasgothia, the Scourge didn't so much destroy the province as it changed it. It wrought great magical change upon Vasgothia. Most of it sort of centered around the Deep Forest and the sacrifice of the passions. And those sort of things really intrigued me, especially, things like the place of renaming and the towers. It just seemed that every time I turned a page in Theron Empire in the Vasgothian chapter, there was another mystery presenting itself. As a games master, those are the sort of things that attract me to running a game. So yeah, I think it was just, it felt very Earthdawn to me. And, I'm going to be fair to Theron Empire. There are some provinces in Theron Empire that don't necessarily feel very Earthdawny, like they fit into the world. But Vasgothia always felt like it was part of the same setting as Barsaive, and it had this strong post-apocalyptic feel to it as well. I think that's what attracted me to it. It was just a different place, but still part of the world that I'd fallen in love with.
Great. Connecting that to another of the questions, how true to the original chapter is the work that you did on the Vasgothia book? Is that something where you really used that original chapter by Robin Laws as a starting point and did more to expand on that? Or was it just a little bit of an influence in terms of the concepts and you were doing a lot more on your own?
I think Robin's a really good writer.
One of the best.
Yeah, Robin's fantastic, and it was a bit daunting at first to sort of try and step into his shoes. And initially, I wanted to try and remain as true to his kind of vision for Vasgothia as I could, because at the time I just thought, well, I'm just a nobody, and I'm coming along and taking Robin's work and trying to make it my own. Initially, I was very keen to stay as close to Robin's work as possible in Vasgothia. But at the same time, because there's only 19 pages in that chapter, and there's so much presented in that chapter that if you're going to expand upon it, then you're going to have to sort of like learn to fly on your own and just take it and run with it. There are certain things that me and Kyle discussed early on with Vasgothia that we did want to change, and certain things needed to be changed. So to give you an example, the Ulkmen, for example. The Ulkmen, as they're presented in Third Empire, they're very intriguing and they're very interesting, but they're not very playable. They don't really present themselves as a good choice for a name-giver race for a player to pick. So they were one of the things that we looked at changing. At the same time, I didn't really want to contradict any of Robin's work. So the changes to the Ulkmen, which is both lore and mechanics, is kind of framed in the way of this is what people thought about the Ulkmen before they realised that this is how they actually are. Because the big change is that the Ulkmen aren't really a separate name-giver race. They're drawn from other name-giver races, and because of the corruption of the Deep Forest, they're altered. Their patterns are altered with horror magic. The canon was important. I really wanted to remain true to Robin's sources, but at the same time, changes needed to be made, and things needed to be expanded, and as the questioner said, like fluffed out. So, yeah, it was definitely something. I think me and Carl both kept it in the back of our minds. We're both big fans of Robin's work, and we wanted to make sure that what we were writing was compatible with what Robin had wrote. But yeah, I mean, when you're taking 19 pages and expanding them into 256 pages, you're going to have to really sort of dig deep into your own imagination and to expand upon the information that Robin had written.
Related to that, I know from being connected to you on various social media that you run a Vasgothia-based campaign currently, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
2 questions. How long have you been running that, and how much of what goes on in that game influenced material that went into the book?
Okay. So I've been running a game set in Vasgothia in one form or another since around about 2016. So first of all, just started running a game using the raw material in Theron Empire to see if that could work on its own without any elaboration or expansion. And then, various campaigns have been run over the years. I'm running one at the moment, which has been going on for about 8 months. The games that I've run for Vasgothia have always been a sort of testing bed for material for the book. So we've play tested some mechanics, we've play tested elements of the setting to see if they're gameable, if they actually work, if players are interested in those sort of things. I've run various games from Empirist perspectives. We've run Barrite games. We've had Leafers. I would say largely I would write material for Vasgothia and then we would introduce it into the campaign. And I would sort of like take feedback and notes from my players about what they liked and what they felt worked. And then that would influence where I would go for like rewrites and things like that. Yeah.
Cool.
Does that answer your question, Tom?
Yeah, no, it does. I think that back and forth, that interaction, that feedback with actual players, with other people, and finding out what captures their attention. Is it the same thing that captures your own? Do they find something different? Does it turn out that upon interaction with live bodies that something you thought was really cool doesn't work quite as well as you had thought? I think that interaction and that feedback, especially for RPG material, is really valuable, and it can be difficult to do that in isolation, to just kind of write a book and come up with it. Even if, say, you weren't doing a book specifically on Vasgothia, that interaction and that play with other people, you get a sense of, in general, what works and what doesn't. And I think, to kind of step away from other stuff for a moment, a lot of what goes into our work with 4th edition in general is based on that actual play experience of, multiple decades between the various sort of shareholding members of the team and freelancers and things like that. A lot of times, something that might not seem to make a whole lot of sense in isolation, once you start piecing it together with other stuff, tends to get a lot better. Going back to an earlier question that I think I can address better than you can, which was why Vasgothia now? The answer to that is mainly logistics. We've got multiple books in various stages of production, and we all work on them on the side. There's nobody that's doing this as a full-time gig. We've all got regular day jobs and commitments and so forth that we need to juggle. And we don't have quite the pipeline for a hard and fast long-term plan for what order things are going to be coming out in. We kind of have a rough idea based on where things are at various stages of development, but the reason that Vasgothia is coming out now is that it's the book that's ready now.
Right.
It's been quite a few months since our last Earthdawn Kickstarter, since our last new bit of product, that being Empty Thrones. We're talking about a year or so. Vasgothia was the first book that was completed. And so that's the book that's coming out. We've got The Grand Bazaar, a book that Michael is working on that we're hoping to have done and ready for Kickstarter in the first half of next year. We've got Morgan's Deeper Secrets magic book that is in development, and my own Europa book, which is much, much earlier in the development process. Part of the issues with both Morgan's book and mine is that we kind of keep getting pulled in to help out with other aspects of things, like I'm going to be doing the layout on Vasgothia, which means that I need to devote my free time to finishing that because it's a book that's paid for and committed and so forth, as opposed to one that is still in kind of the very early outlining and writing stages. So the reason Vasgothia is because this is the book that we have ready at this time. And that's kind of the way that, while it's not ideal in the way that we want to handle things, is the way that things are working right now. And if we want to keep the money engine flowing through the company to allow us to continue to do stuff, we need to put out the product that we have there. We can't just sit on a book because it doesn't fit our mental timeline of things.
Right, yeah.
To bring it back to you a little bit, is there anything in the Vasgothia book that plays a role in or connects in some way to current events in Barsaive, or is it something that's intended to be more of a standalone location book?
One of the things that me and Kyle talked about when we first started writing Vasgothia together was that we didn't necessarily want Vasgothia to feel like it was this distant, remote place that was inaccessible outside of Barsaive, and it sort of existed by its own laws, essentially just an island floating off on its own. We really wanted to connect it into Barsaive. And going back to the earlier question about why Vasgothia, why now, and how does it connect? The release of 4th edition really sort of allowed me to explore Vasgothia a little bit more because of the results of the Second Theran War. Barsaive's victory over the Theran Empire, I always felt, when I read about it in 4th edition, that must have sent shockwaves across the Theran Empire. That must have a knock-on effect on their other provinces. So that's definitely part of the introduction to Vasgothia. Vasgothia exists in the game world as an in-world book. And the reason that the book was written was because some of the Barrite tribes had heard about Barsaive's success against the Theran Empire and were keen to make connections with Barsaive because they also wished to one day liberate themselves from Theran rule. And Vasgothia has been a Theran province for a long time. It's been a Theran province, for well over 1,000 years, and the native Vasgothians have never really known what it's like to not be under Therian occupation. To them, the Therian Empire has been this invincible colossus. And then to hear that, just over to the east, the province over your neighbour essentially has defeated the Therian Empire, and you start to question, well, maybe they're not this invincible colossus we thought we were. Maybe people can be free of Therian rule. So it was definitely the events of the Second War in Barsaive that was the catalyst for the Vasgothia book. I think there's connections to Barsaive in the book. I don't really want to spoil anything, but there's a delegation of Barsaivians who go to Vasgothia and they explore the province and they write about it. And there's various little sort of threads. Yeah, that was the main thing going into it. I didn't want it. I wanted Vasgothia to feel like a place where if you were running a game in Barsaive, you could jump on an airship and you could be in Vasgothia in a day or two and you could start exploring it. I didn't want it to feel like it was this distant land that wasn't connected to the history and the culture of the other lands around it. So it does connect to Barsaive, but it's also very much its own province.
So there's kind of a thematic connection in the idea that we're looking at a place that, unlike Barsaive, where the resistance to Therian rule is something that is long baked into the setting, because here we are, that's something that came out as a result of the dragon's influence on Thrall during the Scourge and the Council Compact and so forth, and the First Therian War, and Barsaive standing up, and Thrall in particular, standing up against the Therians when they returned after the Scourge. We're looking at a similar kind of idea, but with Vasgothia, we're looking at an area where those very first stirrings of anti-Therian sentiment are making themselves known as an actual force.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to a certain extent, the Barrite tribes have always tried to resist Therian rule, but they're a very fractious people, and they're just as likely to war amongst themselves as they are against the Therians. And then you've got a large portion of Vasgothia's population are fully Therianized, and a lot of them sort of enjoy the fruits of Therian civilization in a way that perhaps the dwarves of Thrall once did when they were, they're essentially made the administrators of Barsaive province underneath the Therians. The Empirists are kind of in that position and have been in that position for a very long time. They're not necessarily willing to relinquish the power that they have under Therian rule, but at the same time, they're also very marginalized and they're not quite trusted by the ruling Therians because of the Dread Yearning, which is this magical affliction that can grip an Empirist's mind and send them to the Deep Forest to be renamed as a Barrite. So because of that, the Therians don't quite trust the Empirists to run Vasgothia as much as they may have trusted the dwarves of Barsaive. So you have all these various cultural groups in Vasgothia who are agitating for change, but they don't all necessarily trust or get along with each other. They haven't quite got to the point where they're all willing to throw their lot in together and remove Thera, and many of them don't necessarily want to remove Thera, at least not fully. So I'd say there's some thematical similarities between Barsaive and Vasgothia in that way. It's just that the Therians are much more entrenched in Vasgothia than they were in Barsaive after the Scourge, and that's obviously because the native Barrite population were all destroyed during the Scourge. So when the Therians returned, they only had the more newly renamed Barrite tribes to contend with. There was a long period of time in Vasgothia during the Scourge where there was only one culture dominant, and that was Therian culture in the citadels.
Cool. So rather than being a warmed over, oh, this is Barsaive just in a different physical location with some superficial trappings, there's a lot of thought, it sounds like, that went into the history, both recent and perhaps older, in Vasgothia, and what the consequences of those things are. Because of the events in the Deep Forest with the Passions and the Horrors and the original Barrite tribes, the consequences and the history and the events that played out in the wake of that are different because of those different circumstances. Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Cool. I like to see, when looking at the development of an area, when you're looking at the history and how things play out, both a short and kind of longer term scale historically, that the consequences of things that happen, whether they were choices made by people or were the consequences of something else happening that the sort of aftermath of that makes sense in terms of how people react to it and move forward. So I'm glad to hear that that's something that was consideration. And I know that Kyle is kind of similar in that and probably would have been pressing and other feedback as well. I think probably Morgan had some hands in that and making sure that things made sense from the standpoint of how people behave in general.
Yeah, with Vasgothia, I don't think any of us wanted to sort of retread how things are in Barsaive, where the cultures in Barsaive tend to be very divided along name giver lines. So, you have the Skranga live on the Serpent River, and they have their Arapagwai, and you have the dwarves, the Thrall, and the elves and the Bloodwood. We didn't really want to revisit that with Vasgothia. We didn't want to have, for example, a community of dwarves who lived in the mountains and a community of elves who lived in the deep forest. For us, the big cultural divide came down to Empirist and Barrite. Those are the two large cultures, and then you have Theron, and then you have smaller cultures like Leafers, for example, who are very much kind of on the outside of that. But the two main cultures, like Empirist and Barrite, those two cultures only exist as a direct result of Theron interaction with the province. If the Therons had never come to Vasgothia, those two cultural groups wouldn't exist. And a lot of the things that I enjoy writing about is cultural interaction and what does it mean to be Vasgothian, or is there even such a thing as being Vasgothian when you have all these different cultures? And with the Dread Yearning, it's possible that you could be an Emperist and one of your family members could be a Barrite. And what does that mean? How do you maintain relations across these two different cultures? Those were the sort of things that really interested me in writing Vasgothia, as opposed to different name giver groups.
So this leads into another question, I guess, that kind of just occurred to me. You had mentioned earlier how the original Theron Empire book chapter on Vasgothia seemed to have a new mystery that was presented on each page. And obviously, where you've only got 19 pages in the original book, you get presented the mystery, but there's not really, aside from maybe the occasional bit of theorizing by the in-universe character who's writing about it, these mysteries aren't explained. There's no answers given to them.
Yeah.
Where we're looking at a much larger book where there's been the opportunity to kind of flesh things out, how much of that mystery is still left as mystery? How much of it is explained? Do we, for example, get a more in-depth exploration of what the fruits of the passions are, of why the dread yearning is happening? Or is this something that gets more attention but isn't actually explained?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's actually, I think, one of the first things that me and Kyle talked about. I had my reservation going into Vasgothia was I didn't want to dispel a lot of the mystery of Vasgothia. I didn't want to give too many hard facts. I didn't want to lay down a map of the place of renaming and tell people exactly why it was there, who put it there, who's responsible. Because, first of all, if you dispel too much of the mystery of Vasgothia, I think it loses what makes it Vasgothia in a way. And secondly, I didn't want to provide future games masters and readers with an absolute. I didn't want to say, oh, this is the place of renaming, this is what it does, this is who put it there, because at the end of the day, someone might have a really cool idea to answer those questions, and they might not decide they want to because I've come along and said, oh, no, it's this, this, and this. To answer your question, all those mysteries in Vasgothia, so the towers, the place of renaming, the dread yearning, the fruits of the passions, all these things have been revisited in the material and they've been expanded upon, usually in world by we've added more voices, more people talking about these various mysteries, but we haven't really taken steps to completely dispel what's found there. So, for example, the towers, the information on the towers in the Vasgothia book will help a games master to use them in their campaign, but we haven't mapped out every single tower, and that is obviously there's an upcoming stretch goal for the Kickstarter where the community is going to be able to come along and help us to unravel that mystery of the towers. You can come along and you can help to design a level of the towers, and I think that's great. And I'd rather have that than basically give somebody a battle map of 50 floors of the towers and tell them, this is what's on there, this is why it's there, and this is the nature of how it works. I think that would really dispel, as I say, a lot of the mystery that makes Vasgothia so interesting to me personally.
Cool. Obviously, there was quite a bit of inspiration from the original chapter. You wouldn't have come along 20 years later and gone through all the effort of producing a book if there weren't.
Yeah.
And clearly, Robin Laws in the original drew inspiration from older sources, historical and mythological sources. How much research, how much did you go back to earlier sources, or where are other places outside of Earthdawn material itself did you go for inspiration and perhaps to crib some ideas about stuff to put in this book? Was there any consultation with anybody steeped in the real world geographical area there? I mean, Germany, was there any consultation that you had with Germans from that area to provide input, or was that something that just because of the nature of how the book was put together didn't get much of an opportunity?
So I did what I would call a deep dive on Vasgothia. So the first thing I did was I contacted Robin Laws, and this was before I even sent the initial pitch, I think. And I said to him, "What was your main inspiration?" I think his main inspiration, I thought, was the book Germania, written by Tacitus, and the Poetic Eddas, which is the collection of Norse mythology. And he emailed back and he said, yeah, those were my main inspirations, but obviously they were put through the lens of Earthdawn. So knowing that those were his two sort of literary inspirations, I decided to deep dive on both of those. So I started looking at academic works on the various Germanic tribes, all the pre-Christian pagan Germanic peoples of Europe, the Poetic Eddas, epic Germanic poetry, just anything really that I felt was connected to these original influences by Robin. But I think the really clever thing that Robin did was that he put Earthdawn first. He wasn't necessarily writing fantasy Germany. He was writing Vasgothia. It's interesting because that isn't necessarily the case with some of the other provinces in the book. I think some of the other provinces, the cultural influences kind of eclipses the Earthdawn setting. But with Vasgothia, I always felt he always put Earthdawn first. So you have to really deep dive on those influences. So, for example, the whole idea of the Passions fighting this battle against the horrors and dying during the Scourge is very much based on Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods from Norse mythology. So, I went through the Poetic Eddas and I decided to read all these myths to do with Ragnarok and how some of the gods survived and some of the gods didn't. I went back through and I was reading about Caesar's campaign against the early Germanic tribes, and I really did a deep dive on it. The influences for me, I would say, outside of Germania and the Poetic Edda, would be the history and mythology of the Anglo-Saxon tribes from continental Germany, the Visigothic people, the pre-Christian Franks. I tried to avoid direct Norse sources because while I admit that Vasgothia does occupy a certain space within role-playing games, I didn't want it to be a Viking role-playing game because there's other Viking role-playing games on the market and I feel that ground's been covered quite well. So I purposefully avoided too much Norse and Viking inspiration and instead looked at much earlier people in Germany. As for consulting German people, one of my players is German, which I'm quite lucky really that I met him. And I would say consultation-wise, when it came to Vasgothian words, so there's a lot of terminology in Vasgothia which is written in the Vasgothian language. I wanted to make sure that the words didn't sound too silly or offensive or just dumb to a modern German reader, because I'm quite aware that German people will read this book, and if there was a term in there that they just thought was ridiculous, that would fall upon my shoulders. So me and my German player Jan, I gave him a full list of the lexicon of Vasgothian words, and we were able to go through and pick words out that he felt needed changing or didn't quite fit or may sound like a rude word in German or something like that. But outside of that, no, I didn't really. I consulted academic literature on the subject, and a lot of that is written by German writers. But being German doesn't necessarily bestow you with the knowledge of ancient Germania. I mean, I'm English, and I don't automatically know about ancient England and Celtic peoples. This is something that you really have to study at a degree academic level. So I didn't really sort of reach out to any specific German people outside of my player, really. No, I didn't really think it was too necessary.
And that was in part because of the academic research that you did, which had been done by German academics in some cases and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, almost everything that I read and studied on Germanic folklore was written by German writers anyway. So obviously they have a perspective on it already. So, for example, something similar like Jacob Grimm from the Grimm's Brothers, his Deutsche Mythology series of books, for example, that was a source of research and inspiration for Vasgothia. But as I say, the main focus has always been to make Vasgothia and not just fantasy Germany, if that makes sense.
That's one of the things that our goal is, having talked within the core team, when it comes to approaching these older chapters of the Theran Empire. And I agree, I think Vasgothia is one of the easiest ones to deal with because it does have such a Earthdawn friendly and Earthdawn heavy slant right from the beginning, as opposed to Indrizia, for example.
Yeah.
I think one of the weaknesses of the Theran Empire book is that there is so little space that is able to be devoted to each of these massive cultures. When comparing that to Barsaive, which up to that point had a dozen or more source books and hundreds of thousands of words devoted to exploring the variety of life experience and culture among the various peoples of that land, you compare that to a 15 or 20 page chapter that needs to cover an equivalent sized area in a tiny fraction of the space, you're going to be hitting the highlights that come across as stereotypical and not as good. And I think one of the things that our goal is, as we revisit each of these, because long term we sort of do have a plan to do so, is to take those initial seeds that were presented, because those date back all the way to at least the original Skypoint and Vivane box. If you look at the one paragraph descriptions for each of the provinces that appeared in that book, they're all laid out there ahead of time for you, right? It's not like this came out of nothing.
Yeah.
But to get into them in more depth and to apply more attention and nuance and provide a greater level of detail at multiple levels in order to take some of those fascinating cultural ideas, and crank the Earthdawn dial on them up to see how we can do that. And one of the things that we're concerned with, and this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, is to make sure that we are doing what we can to honor the original cultures that those are being drawn from. And this is one of the reasons that, again, Vasgothia is kind of a little bit easier to tackle, is that getting access to Germanic scholarship on the things there, it's a lot easier to get access to in some respects than it is to, say, subcontinental India and the study of the mythology that is not presented from a Western scholar from the British Museum kind of things, who has a very different approach to what was going on in the culture that's being drawn from.
Yeah, and that's the difference. With Vasgothia, I can read about Germanic culture from a Germanic voice, whereas if I was writing a book on Indrizia, there's a good chance that a lot of those voices are not going to be representative of the culture that Indrizia draws upon. You're absolutely right. I mean, I have had it quite easy in a way, and but I agree 100%. The right voice for the project is definitely an important thing to consider, 100%.
So if anybody out there is listening and actually is part of those and wants to get involved, please reach out to me or anybody else at Facet Games, and we will open conversations.
Yeah, awesome.
So you've spent the past few years working on this book in various levels of involvement. Now that the book is basically done, what are a couple of things that are in the book that you are particularly excited for readers to encounter?
Wow. The thing that I'm excited for the most is probably, and this is going off my game group, and what sort of excited them the most was experiencing life in a Theran province. My players really enjoy the difference between the civilized life that you can have in the Theran cities, and then you leave the Theran cities and suddenly you're thrown into a chaotic wilderness of magical strangeness. So the things that I'm really excited about and looking forward to other people enjoying is obviously the Deep Forest. I think the Deep Forest has got so much potential to keep player groups busy, and there's the Fruit of the Passions in there, which is quite a unique reward treasure for players to earn or for games masters to give to their players. I'm not fully versed on the mechanics behind the Fruit of the Passions. That's more Morgan's sort of domain than mine. But the Deep Forest and the towers, these are the things I'm really sort of excited about. I'm excited to see what people make of the different cultural groups, because my campaign is made of Empirist characters. So I have run games with Barrites, but I'm really interested and excited to see what people do with the Barrite culture, because there's an entire chapter in the book on the Barrites. That's something that me and Carl really wanted to get fleshed out, was Barrite culture. We didn't want them to be just these bloodthirsty barbarians that the Therans are sort of intent on trying to tell everyone that they are. So yeah, I'm looking forward to people playing Barrite groups and Empress groups and maybe a mixture of the two, and traveling to all these magical strange places like the Deep Forest and the towers and the Carroxburn Mountains. And I'm pretty happy and proud with all of it, to be honest with you. All of Vasgothia excites me to some degree. So the thing the most is I really want to, in the future, I want to hear stories about people running games in Vasgothia. That would be the most exciting thing to me.
Great.
Cool.
Anything else that comes to mind that has not come up or that I missed in terms of the questions? I kind of know that you saw the thread on Facebook with the questions there. I think I've hit, at least, if not directly asking the question, we've hit on the subject of most of those pretty clearly. Actually, I've got one here because I know I do this.
Okay.
Any Easter eggs to your own player group or Vasgothia campaigns that you have run in the past that you slipped in? Yeah,
there is definitely some Easter eggs from my group. There are some NPCs in the book who are actually player characters from some of my games. I won't give away who they are, but that's definitely in there. There's definitely some events, because some of the events that are described in the sort of modern history of Vasgothia are events that we've actually played in the game and then made their way into the book as history. So again, I don't want to spoil anything or talk about some of these modern events, but there is currently a large rebellion taking place in Vasgothia at the moment. Some of my players have been involved in the very sort of early catalyst for that rebellion and how it started and the characters that were met along the way. But yeah, there's a couple of Easter eggs from my group, and they're not too many, because it would feel a little bit self-indulgent if I was just populating the book with NPCs and players from my group. But yeah, there's a couple in there, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. To be clear, this is not simply a case of Nick wrote up his campaign and we published it.
Yeah, no, not at all, no.
Accusations that have been leveled on me about some of the aspects of 4th edition history. The Harwood incident in particular is one that people feel is something that, oh, he did this in his game and he gets to drop it in.
Right.
That's actually something that I came up with whole cloth. And the fact that it feels like a player character thing or a campaign thing is intentional. Like, I intentionally created an event that would have that feel that player characters got involved and things went south.
Yeah.
That gives a ready hook for another game master to take that and draw their own conclusions and run with it. I think that those kind of hooks are really, really useful to put into a game. A place where Earthdawn is on one level, when you're talking about Barsaive, and the story of Barsaive is about the maneuverings between these large political powers or powerful beings. I mean, between the dragons and the immortal elves and the kingdom of Thrall. but there is also, at the more basic level, the idea that player characters can get involved in things and help shape the future of what's going on. That you get these powerful adepts, particularly once you get into journeyman, upper journeyman, warden, or master tier characters, that there are not very many of them, and the amount of power that they actually are able to wield personally and magically and politically can dramatically shape the events of things. And having those kind of hooks where the future of the province, where the Second Theron War is kicked into motion because of a seemingly unrelated thing that happened, but the king sees that as an opportunity to push for their own agenda. Doing that kind of thing, and always keeping an eye towards how a game master might use it in a game.
Yep.
How that material can be taken by individual groups and made their own and used as a starting point for inspiration for their own campaigns and stories, rather than going up our own hind ends in terms of getting lost in the lore and the creation of this fictional world without an idea of where a player character might actually fit into that and influence that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think the Harwood instance is a really good comparison to make to, what's going on in Vasgothia. I'd say the players were involved in it, but it was always going to be part of the history of Vasgothia. It's just that we got to game a little bit earlier than everyone else. But yeah, I agree. And I think the good thing about Vasgothia is there's two ways to use Vasgothia, really. You can set a campaign in Vasgothia and you can play as Empirists and Barrites or what have you, or you can bring your existing Barsaive group into Vasgothia, because the way the book's set up is there are communication lines being drawn between the various cultures in Vasgothia and Barsaive, and I always wanted it to feel like a place where your group could jump on an airship and get there in a day and just start getting involved.
It would be really interesting to see, or even to think about, what a liberator, like someone following the path of the liberator, would do faced with this society, with this present situation in Vasgothia.
Yeah, and on the inverse, it'd be really interesting to see what a Leafer is like when they go to the Dalia's jungle or the Bloodwood. It can go both ways. I know there's some new player options available in Vasgothia as well, so that's another reason that it might excite games masters and players. So, there's nothing saying you couldn't play a Leafer character in Barsaive, for example.
One other thing that just occurred to me is we'd been talking a lot about the setting material and things that you worked on in terms of fleshing out the original and expanding and providing more depth, especially when it comes to things like the Barrite culture and whatnot. Is there anything that you worked on, or is there a chapter in there that is more GM directed? That is, we're not looking at an in-setting book, but we're looking at a chapter or section where we are more directly offering advice or suggestions on how to use the material in that book in a game?
Yeah, so my understanding is there's game information chapters in Vasgothia. I believe there's a player's information chapter and a games master's information chapter. At least that's the information on the Kickstarter page. I'm not really a big mechanics guy, and this is something that I discussed going into the project. I was very happy for Morgan to help on that front because he's so great with the mechanics, and he's got the brain for it, and he's really good with that sort of stuff. So I can't actually say what elements of Vasgothia have been fully gamified and will appear in the GM chapter. Presumably, there's going to be things like the fruits of the passions and these sort of things. But I'm honestly not too sure what's going to be there. But there's definitely going to be information mechanically for games masters to use.
I wasn't even necessarily thinking about mechanics because I know those are in there.
Okay.
Just more sort of general advice, like what kinds of campaigns or ideas or how you might take the information in the Barrites chapter to flesh out or enhance your own campaign stories or ideas.
Yeah, I believe there's advice on how to run various campaigns, because obviously there's another option you have here with Vasgothia is Theron characters. As easy as it is to sort of present the Theron Empire as this monolithic structure of evil, and it is in many ways, individual theory and characters tend to be a little bit more nuanced. There's nothing saying that some theory nobles may not be involved in the rebellion, that they may not also be agitating for change in Vasgothia or allying with the Barrites. So I believe there's advice for Games Masters on how to run these various different sort of cultures within the campaign. But in all honesty,
that wasn't something that you had been really involved with in terms of that work. Okay.
The reason for that is because even though I'm the lead writer for Vasgothia, it really isn't just my show. Like Kyle and Morgan have done some absolutely fantastic work on Vasgothia, and if you read the book and you come across an idea and you think, oh, it's a really cool idea, I really like that, there's a good chance that it was Kyle's idea, or there's a good chance that it was Morgan's idea, not necessarily my idea. I never wanted to sort of claim ownership of Vasgothia. I wanted it to be, I wanted to hear other people's opinions on it. So yeah, I'm just not fully aware of what's actually going to appear in the book 100%, because I'm not responsible for writing 100% of the material, if that makes sense. So yeah, some of it's going to be a big surprise to me too.
Well, that's great. Yeah, we do really make an effort to have multiple people contributing and providing feedback, even in a certain sense that we've talked about on this show when we've been going through the essays on the various paths, that some of the sidebars and third-party commentary were provided by other people, sometimes provided by the person who wrote the original essay, sometimes by people like myself or Morgan or Kyle or any of the others who had an idea that they wanted to provide as a counterpoint to something that was being presented in setting, to add that little bit of uncertainty and variety. I knew it was going on, but I am still happy to hear that that's a practice that is continuing on with a more expansive and in-depth book like this.
Yeah, and it was a great experience as well. It's working on Vasgothia with Kyle, and to a sort of lesser degree Morgan. I've not worked with Morgan too closely, mostly with Kyle. It's been great, and we come up with ideas together. We bounce ideas off each other, and Kyle's great at coming up with options for an idea. You might say, well, this idea doesn't quite work, but here's option A, B, and C, and how we can make it work. And it's just been absolutely fantastic. And Vasgothia really is. It's a team product. I just want to make, I don't want to, as I say, I don't want to claim ownership of the book. It really is a group effort.
We're just about at the end of an hour here. So just to wrap things up, is there anything on the horizon for you that you are working on or have been approached at with regards to Earthdawn? Have we soured you? Are you done with us?
No, I'm definitely not soured. I've had such a positive, fantastic experience working as a freelancer for FASA, and to be given Vasgothia as my first proper book by the team has just been a dream come true. I never thought that would happen, especially because it didn't happen under Red Brick. And I'm not knocking Red Brick at all. Those guys were busy doing their thing at the time. I would love to work on more Earthdawn projects. I'm not too sure if I would revisit another Theran province or not, because I don't know if any of them sort of interested me as much as Vasgothia. I would say Quiana is a province that really interested me, and I believe that you guys, there's a member of your team already working on Quiana, so if Quiana wasn't in the works, I think that is something that would interest me. But again, we go back to getting the right voice for that project. There's definitely some areas of Barsaive I would be interested in exploring. I think Landis is a big sort of fog covered area of the Barsaive map that I would really like to get involved in. So hopefully I can pitch you guys some projects, or you can pitch me something and we can work together again, because it's been absolutely fantastic.
Anything that we've missed, anything that you want to mention here as we wrap up?
I don't think so. I'm really looking forward to the Kickstarter stretch goals. I think the next one coming up, as I said, is the Towers. This is a great opportunity for anyone who's wanted to write for Earthdawn to sort of get involved in that project. Obviously, there's some sort of stipulations that come along to designing your own level for the Towers, but I really want people to get involved in that. I won't be writing any levels for the Towers. I really want to see what other people can come up with from the community for the Towers, so I won't be taking part in that. There is an adventure as well. Hopefully we can get to that stretch goal, because I have a pre-written adventure for Vasgothia, which I've run a couple of times, called Daughter of the Forest. And it's designed as a launching pad for a campaign in Vasgothia. And it details all the sort of aspects of what it's like to be in Vasgothia. It details with themes of living under fear and oppression, what it means to be an Empress, what it means to be a Barrite, renaming, dread yearning, the deep forest. It just had all these things in it that are just great jumping off point for a Vasgothian campaign. So fingers crossed we can get to stretch goal for that adventure. Yeah, I think that's it really. I just look forward to the community enjoying Vasgothia and seeing what they do with it.
Great. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to come on the show and talk about this new book. I'm excited for it. I can't wait to actually start reading it as I work through layout here over the course of the next couple of weeks. If you were not aware, we've been talking about the new book that we've got on Kickstarter, Vasgothia. Go to Kickstarter.com, search for FASA Games, search for Earthdawn, search for Vasgothia. It should come right up. We've got links on all of our social media. It is running out through November 19th. As of right now, we are at $27,247 on the campaign with 334 backers and just shy of 3 weeks to go. When this episode goes up, there will be even fewer days left. So if you are not already backed, go and do that. What are you waiting for? Once again, thank you, Nick, for joining me. I've heard nothing but good things from Kyle about working with you. And certainly if we get the opportunity to have you contribute to something else, we will do that.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Thanks for having me on the show. It's been really fun talking about Vasgothia. As Kyle can attest, I can talk about Vasgothia all day long. So it's good to rein me in for just an hour or so.
Thanks again, everybody, for joining us here this week on the Earthdawn Survival Guide. From Dan, who will be back with me next time. I'm not sure what he would say. It is time to go and rename your legend.
Nice.